He changed the Netflix password on a Tuesday, specifically to lock me out while his new girlfriend watched movies in my living room. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I quietly opened my laptop, logged into the county property portal, and printed the deed to the house. 48 hours later, his entire world collapsed and he never saw it coming. To understand how a man becomes arrogant enough to lock a woman out of her own streaming account in her own home, you have to understand the slow, invisible creep of entitlement. Mark and I had been together for 4 years. When we met, I was 28, focused, and fiercely independent. I had spent my 20s building a career in technical project management and carefully saving every bonus, every extra paycheck. By the time I met Mark, I had already purchased a beautiful 3-bedroom house in a quiet Austin suburb, but I didn't buy it in my name. I bought it through an LLC I had formed specifically for privacy and asset protection. It was a detail I rarely discussed because, frankly, it wasn't anyone's business. Mark moved in during our 2nd year together. At first, it was subtle. He brought over a toothbrush, then a drawer full of clothes, and eventually, his entire life bled into mine. He insisted on taking over the utility bills. At the time, I thought it was a gesture of partnership. He would say things like, "Let me handle the lights and the water, babe. It's the least I can do for our home." Notice the pronoun, our home. I let it slide because correcting him felt petty. It sounded like the kind of family drama you read about online, the type of petty bickering I wanted to avoid. That was my first mistake. Mark grew up as the undisputed golden child in a fiercely matriarchal family. His mother, Brenda, treated him not as a son, but as a prince temporarily displaced from his throne. In Brenda's eyes, Mark could do no wrong, and everything he touched rightfully belonged to him. When Brenda visited, she would walk through my kitchen, trailing her fingers over the granite countertops, and say, "Mark has such wonderful taste. I'm so glad he finally has a house that matches his potential." I would stand there, biting the inside of my cheek until it bled, smiling politely. I never corrected her. I never said, "Actually, Brenda, Mark didn't pick out this granite." I did, 5 years ago, with my own money. I swallowed the truth to keep the atmosphere pleasant. I thought I was being mature. I thought I was taking the high road. Over the next 2 years, the dynamic shifted from annoying to suffocating. Mark began treating my house like his personal kingdom. He invited his friends over for poker nights without asking, leaving me to clean up the empty bottles and crushed cardboard the next morning. He started making improvements, painting the guest room a harsh, sterile gray without consulting me, claiming it was going to be his new gaming office. When I finally voiced my frustration, his reaction was a masterclass in deflection. "I'm just trying to make this place feel like mine, too," he would sigh, looking at me with wide, wounded eyes. "You're always so controlling. Can't we just share a life without you constantly reminding me that you make more money?" He weaponized my success against me. He made me feel guilty for having boundaries, turning every request for respect into a personal attack on his masculinity. And because I loved him, or at least the version of him I thought existed, I compromised. I gave him the guest room. I paid for the groceries. I let him upgrade his car while I continued driving my old sedan. I made myself smaller so he could feel bigger. But the friction kept building. He became increasingly secretive with his phone, turning the screen away whenever I walked into the room. He started working late on Fridays, coming home smelling faintly of sweet perfume and stale bar air. I wasn't naive, but the mind has a brilliant, terrible way of protecting itself from truths it isn't ready to handle. I ignored the signs because acknowledging them meant blowing up my life. The tipping point arrived on a rainy afternoon in late October. I was supposed to be in Dallas for a 3-day conference. The connection on the hotel Wi-Fi kept buffering, making it impossible to upload my presentation files, so I decided to drive back a day early. I didn't text him. I just wanted to sleep in my own bed. When I pulled into the driveway, there was a silver Honda Civic parked in my spot. I didn't storm the front door. I walked quietly to the side window of the living room. Through the gap in the blinds, I saw them. Mark was sprawled on my velvet sofa, laughing, handing a glass of my expensive wine to a woman I didn't recognize. She was wearing my favorite oversized sweater. They were scrolling through the Netflix menu. I stood in the rain, feeling the cold seep into my bones, and I realized something profound. If you are listening to this and something feels familiar, if you have ever felt like you were constantly walking on eggshells in your own life, you need to understand the difference between keeping the peace and surrendering your soul. Keeping the peace is a polite name for slow self-destruction. When you tolerate disrespect to avoid an argument, you are teaching them that your boundaries are negotiable. You are showing them that your comfort is a currency they can spend. Stop shrinking. Stop swallowing your truth to make a narcissistic system comfortable. Let them be mad. Let them be uncomfortable. Your peace is not found in their approval, it is found in your own absolute clarity. I didn't knock on the window. I walked back to my car, drove to a nearby hotel, and opened my laptop. I tried to log into my Netflix account to cancel the subscription, but the password had been changed. He had locked me out. I let out a short, humorless laugh. The sheer audacity of it. He was sitting in my house, drinking my wine, entertaining his mistress, and he thought changing a password gave him the upper hand. What I've told you so far is how he made himself comfortable in a life I built. What comes next is how I dismantled that comfort, piece by legal piece. I spent the night at the hotel. I didn't send a single text. My phone stayed silent. When I woke up the next morning, the crushing weight of betrayal had vanished. In its place was a sharp, clinical emptiness. My blood ran cold, not from fear, but from the sudden, absolute certainty of what I was about to do. I didn't cry. I took action. Instead of driving home, I went straight to my office. I locked the door, closed the blinds, and opened my laptop. I needed to isolate his financial footprint from my actual asset. Getting the deed from the county portal was just the baseline. I needed bank statements, LLC tax returns, and a complete ledger of the utility bills he had paid. If you were listening to this, and you were sharing your home with someone who isn't on the title, you need to understand exactly what a paper trail is and how to build one before you need it. Paying a water bill or a Wi-Fi subscription does not magically grant someone equity in real estate, but allowing them to finance permanent structural improvements can blur the legal lines. Financial abuse is still abuse, and it leaves evidence. A document signed before conflict is your basic self-preservation. You cannot rely on an oral agreement when the other person benefits from misunderstanding you. Armed with that clarity, I pulled the LLC operating agreement. The property was owned by Blue Horizon Holdings LLC, a company of which I was the sole managing member. Mark had absolutely no idea. To him, Blue Horizon was just the name of the generic corporate landlord that I supposedly rented from. It was a lie of omission I had maintained since he moved in, initially out of privacy and later out of self-preservation. I printed the deed, the LLC state registration, and a pristine ledger of every single mortgage payment I had made from my private accounts. Not a single cent of his money had ever touched the principal or interest of this house. I drove home that evening at my normal time. When I walked through the door, the silver Honda was gone. Mark was sprawled on the couch, a controller in his hands, exactly where I had left him in my mind. He didn't even look up. "You're back early," he muttered, his eyes glued to the screen. "The conference wrapped up," I said. I kept my voice steady. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and casually asked, "By the way, did something happen to the Netflix account?" My tablet logged me out at the hotel. He paused the game and gave me a practiced, condescending sigh. "Oh yeah. The router was acting weird, so I reset the network and changed the passwords for security. I'll log you back in later. Don't worry your pretty little head about it. Don't worry your pretty little head about it." The audacity. He was practically mocking me, draped across my furniture, secure in his delusion of control. "Thanks," I smiled. Over the next 3 weeks, I became a ghost in my own relationship. I nodded politely at his complaints about his boss. I dutifully folded his laundry. I sat next to him on the velvet sofa while he watched movies on the Netflix account he had stolen from me, pretending I didn't see him texting his mistress under a throw blanket. I was the perfect, docile, submissive girlfriend he had always wanted me to be. But behind the scenes, I was a machine. I moved my most valuable jewelry, my passport, and my hard drives into a secure safety deposit box. I slowly packed out-of-season clothing and sentimental items, storing them in the trunk of my car and transferring them to a rented climate-controlled storage unit during my lunch breaks. Every time he raised his voice over a misplaced set of keys or a cold dinner, I just smiled. He thought he was breaking my spirit. He didn't realize I was just clearing the blast radius. Then came the catalyst. The moment Mark decided to overplay his hand, fueled by the toxic entitlement his mother had pumped into his veins since birth. It was a Sunday morning. He was eating breakfast when he dropped a thick, glossy folder onto the granite kitchen island. "I've been thinking," he announced, tapping the folder with a smug grin. "This place is feeling a little cramped. I want to knock down the wall between the kitchen and the living room. Open concept. I've got a contractor coming tomorrow to give us an estimate." I stared at the folder. "A contractor? For a house we rent?" He waved his hand dismissively, popping a grape into his mouth. "Oh, come on. We've been paying off some faceless corporation's mortgage for 4 years. It's basically ours. Besides, I'm the one paying the utilities. It's time I pitched in for the heavy lifting. We'll cover the renovation out of pocket, and then we can approach the landlord about doing a rent-own setup. We can just put my name on the new lease, to protect my investment." He wanted to permanently alter a house he didn't own, to leverage a rent-own scheme on a property I already held the deed to, using the electric bill as his bargaining chip to steal equity. I let out a short, humorless laugh. "What's so funny?" he snapped, his fragile ego instantly bruised by the sound. "Nothing," I replied smoothly, picking up my coffee cup. "Jess, an open concept. It's a big step. Are you sure the landlord will approve?" "Well, I'm making executive decisions now," he said, puffing out his chest. "I'm not asking for permission. Tomorrow at noon. Be here to let the guy in." I didn't argue. The next day, I didn't meet his contractor. Instead, I met with my attorney in a high-rise downtown. The receptionist misspelled my name on the intake form, and I had to wait 40 agonizing minutes in a freezing lobby. But when I finally sat down, the plan was set. We drafted a formal, legally ironclad 3-day notice to quit for a holdover tenant. Because Mark had never signed a lease with Blue Horizon Holdings LLC, and because he was merely contributing to utilities without a formal rental agreement, he was classified under Texas property law as a month-to-month tenant at sufferance. He had the rights. I scheduled the delivery of the eviction notice for a very specific date, November 15th. That date wasn't random. It was the exact day Mark's mother, Brenda, was hosting a massive, fully catered family dinner at her country club to celebrate his 35th birthday. The golden child was going to be surrounded by his entire court of enablers. I was meticulously planning his legal and social execution. But what I found inside that glossy contractor's folder later that evening changed everything I thought I knew about the past 4 years. I opened the glossy folder Mark had so arrogantly tossed onto my kitchen island. It wasn't just a simple contractor's estimate for knocking down a wall. It was a comprehensive architectural blueprint for a massive, $80,000 master suite addition. But the floor plan wasn't what made my stomach drop. It was the cover page. The client information block didn't list my name. It listed Mark Davis and Chloe Vance. Chloe. I hadn't even known the mistress's name until I saw it printed there in crisp, black Arial font. He wasn't just planning to renovate my house. He was planning to customize it for her. He was meticulously designing a dual vanity bathroom and a walk-in closet for another woman. Inside the walls I had paid for, beneath the blueprints was something infinitely worse. It was a preliminary application for a home equity line of credit. Mark had actually attempted to initiate a bank loan against the property to fund the renovation. He had forged my signature on the bottom line. He was operating under the staggering, delusional belief that his name on the water and electric bills somehow granted him legal authority to borrow against the physical estate. He was trying to drain the equity I had spent my entire 20s building, all to create a luxurious nest for his affair. The sheer criminality of it took my breath away. He was willing to commit federal mortgage fraud just to maintain his facade of wealth and success. For the next 3 days, my life became a masterclass in compartmentalization. I had to live with a man I knew was trying to financially ruin me, and I couldn't let my mask slip for a single second. I continued to make his coffee. I continued to listen to his mundane stories about office politics. I watched him text Chloe from the couch, a smug little smile playing on his lips, while my eviction notice sat finalized and waiting in my lawyer's outbox. Every night, I lay awake in the dark, listening to him breathe, feeling a profound, terrifying disgust. For 4 years, I absorbed his entitlement quietly. That ends here. November 15th arrived crisp and cold. Brenda had rented the private dining room at an upscale country club to celebrate his 35th birthday. Over 50 people were packed into the opulent space: aunts, uncles, cousins, and a dozen of Mark's sycophantic college friends. I wore a tailored emerald dress, immaculate makeup, and a perfectly pleasant smile. My stomach was a tight knot of adrenaline, and my throat was agonizingly dry, a minor, frustrating imperfection that made it hard to swallow every time someone asked me how the high couple was doing. But I kept my voice steady. I carried a heavy, oversized gift bag with a silver ribbon. Mark was entirely in his element, holding a glass of expensive scotch, soaking in the admiration of a room full of people who had been trained since his birth to applaud his sheer existence. When the waiters brought out the champagne flutes, Mark clinked his glass with a fork. "I want to thank my incredible mother for this party and all of you for being here," he announced, projecting his voice over the crowd. 35 is a milestone. I'm stepping into my prime. I'm making executive moves at work. And frankly, taking over the house renovations is just the beginning of my real estate portfolio. To building an empire. I stepped forward, placing the heavy gift bag on the table in front of him. "I brought you something to help with that empire, Mark," I said, my tone perfectly even and pleasant. "You should open it now, before they serve the cake." He reached in and pulled out a thick, black leather folio. Inside was the property deed, the Blue Horizon LLC state registration proving I was the sole owner, and the formal, legally binding 3-day notice to quit. Mark flipped open the folio with a condescending smirk. The smirk died instantly. His eyes darted across the bold header of the deed, then down to the eviction notice, his face training of all color until his skin matched the white linen tablecloths. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound escaping his throat. His hands began to tremble so violently that the papers audibly rattled against the leather binding. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and finally realized gravity applied to him. Brenda leaned over his shoulder to read the documents, letting out a sharp, genuine gasp of horror that cut through the dining room. The room went dead silent. "You have 72 hours to get off my property." The silence shattered like glass. Brenda's face flushed a deep, mottled purple. "What is the meaning of this?" she screeched, lunging forward, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "He pays the bills. He lives there. You can't just throw him out into the street, you ungrateful little." "He pays the utilities." "Brenda," I interrupted, never raising my voice, addressing her with cold precision, "which makes him a month-to-month tenant at sufferance under Texas property law. He has no equity. He has no lease. And because he attempted to forge my signature on a loan application for a property he does not own, he is incredibly lucky I am handing him an eviction notice instead of a police report." Mark just stared at me, his eyes wide, terrified, and utterly humiliated. The golden child was completely exposed in front of his entire court. If you are listening to this, and you have ever been called cruel for standing up for yourself, you need to understand something fundamental. Boundaries are simply a description of what you will and will not accept. Enforcing them is not cruelty, it is clarity. People who scream the loudest about your lack of loyalty have usually done the least to actually earn it. You cannot reason with someone who actively benefits from misunderstanding you, and you owe absolutely zero explanations to a family system built on enabling abuse. Leaving quietly, legally, and permanently is the most powerful thing you can do. I turned on my heel and walked out of the country club, leaving them to choke on the ruins of his shattered ego. But a cornered narcissist doesn't just accept public defeat gracefully, and what he did the very next morning proved I hadn't been paranoid. I hadn't been paranoid enough. I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong because a cornered narcissist, stripped of their narrative control, is the most dangerous version of themselves. Walking out of that country club felt like a clean, surgical strike. But the next 72 hours taught me exactly what victory costs when you are dismantling a delusion. I didn't return to the house immediately. I packed a small overnight bag from my office and stayed at my sister's place across town. I knew Mark would not collapse quietly. I knew the retaliation was coming. And within 4 hours of the birthday dinner, the smear campaign officially began. Brenda orchestrated it like a seasoned general deploying troops. She posted a massive, tearful essay on Facebook, deliberately tagging my employer, my colleagues, and my extended family. The post detailed how a greedy, cold-hearted woman was throwing her devoted, hardworking son out onto the street after he had spent years paying her bills, fixing her home, and unconditionally supporting her career. The gaslighting was breathtaking. It wasn't just an interpersonal tactic anymore. When weaponized by a narcissistic family system, gaslighting becomes a coordinated public spectacle designed to break your will. My phone vibrated endlessly with messages from distant relatives and confused acquaintances demanding explanations. Mark himself bombarded me with a relentless stream of texts, oscillating wildly between vicious, profane insults and pathetic, manipulative begging. He told me I was destroying his life. He told me I owed him a second chance. Years ago, in a completely different life, I might have caved. I would have internalized the blame, apologized for setting a boundary, and I packed my bags to leave my own kingdom just to keep the peace. But not this time. I took screenshots of every single defamatory post, every unhinged text message, and forwarded them directly to my lawyer to draft a formal, aggressive cease and desist order again. Sent Brenda. On the morning of November 18th, the 72-hour eviction deadline expired. At exactly noon, I arrived at the property with a private security contractor and a professional locksmith. Of course, it wasn't a cinematic, flawless operation. The locksmith got stuck in gridlock traffic on Interstate 35 and ran 40 agonizing minutes late. I had to sit in my SUV at the end of my own driveway, watching the front door of my own house, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was a minor, infuriating delay, but sitting there, feeling like an intruder on my own property, tested every single ounce of discipline I had left. When the locksmith finally arrived and breached the front door, the interior was a disaster zone. Mark hadn't just packed his clothes, he had attempted to systematically dismantle the kitchen. He had unplugged the stainless steel refrigerator, leaving hundreds of dollars of groceries to rot and pool stagnant water onto the hardwood floor. He had even tried to unbolt the washing machine from the wall, leaving deep gouges in the drywall, abandoning his tools on the floor when he realized he didn't have the physical strength to move the heavy appliance alone. He was standing in the center of the living room, surrounded by black trash bags, looking utterly feral. When he saw me step through the door with the security contractor, he lost his mind. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, screaming to the dispatcher that an illegal squatter was trying to forcefully remove him from his permanent residence. 2 Austin police officers arrived less than 10 minutes later. Mark immediately rushed out to the porch, launching into a hysterical, breathless monologue. He pointed at me, waving his printed utility bills, aggressively demanding that I be arrested for trespassing and harassment. He was so confident, so deeply entrenched in his mother's lifelong delusion, that he actually believed the police would arrest me in my own home. I didn't shout. I kept my voice steady. I waited for him to run out of breath, and then I calmly handed the lead officer the blue leather folio containing the LLC registration, the certified property deed, and the sign. Expired notice to quit. The officer read the documents in silence. He asked Mark for a lease agreement. Mark proudly presented a printed email receipt for the October Wi-Fi bill. The officer let out a long, exhausted sigh. He handed the folio back to me, turned to Mark, and spoke in a voice devoid of any sympathy. "Sir, you have no legal standing here. This is her property. You have exactly 15 minutes to gather your remaining belongings and vacate the premises, or you will be leaving in the back of my cruiser." Watching Mark drag those heavy trash bags down the driveway while his mother pulled up in her pristine SUV to collect him was a picture of absolute, pathetic defeat. Brenda didn't even get out of the car. She just popped the trunk, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, refusing to look at me as her precious golden child stuffed his garbage bags into the back of her luxury vehicle. He looked small. He looked ridiculous. And yet, standing on my porch, I didn't feel the crushing guilt Brenda had desperately tried to instill in me. If you are listening to this, and you have ever felt like you are a terrible person for finally prioritizing your own survival, you must understand a critical distinction between guilt and shame. Guilt is the feeling that you did something bad. Shame is the toxic feeling that you are bad. Narcissistic systems don't just want you to feel guilty for setting a boundary. They want you to feel deep, paralyzing shame for daring to exist outside of their control. They weaponize your own empathy, convincing you that self-respect is actually selfishness. When Brenda launched her smear campaign, she was trying to drown me in shame. But here is your exit strategy. Recognize that their anger is not your responsibility. Today, I want you to take one concrete action. Write down your core boundary on a piece of paper and explicitly remind yourself that enforcing it is a medical necessity, not an act of malice. I watched Brenda's SUV disappear around the corner. I walked back inside my quiet, empty house, and the locksmith installed a heavy-duty, reinforced deadbolt on the front door. I thought locking that door behind him was the end of the story. I thought the war was finally over and I could begin the slow process of cleaning up the mess. What I pulled out of the air conditioning vent in the guest room the next morning wasn't just proof of his infidelity. It was a ticking legal time bomb that threatened to burn my entire life to the ground. I had noticed a faint, metallic rattling coming from the air conditioning vent in the guest room, the room Mark had so aggressively claimed as his new office. At first, I thought it was just a loose screw left behind by his pathetic attempt to play contractor, but when I brought in a stepladder to inspect the grill, I saw it. Tucked just behind the metal slats, carefully taped to the inside of the aluminum ductwork, was a thick, heavy manila envelope completely covered in a thick layer of dust. I pulled it out, my fingers coated in grime, and carried it to the kitchen island. Inside were 3 premium, high-limit credit cards. They hadn't been issued in Mark's name. They hadn't been issued in my name either. The embossed silver lettering on all 3 cards read, Brenda Davis. Beneath the cards was a neatly folded stack of billing statements dating back over 8 months. Mark hadn't just been using his mother's accounts. He had systematically intercepted her pre-approved credit offers, activated them using her social security number, and diverted He paper statements to an electronic inbox she didn't know existed. The balance across the 3 cards was staggering, nearly $42,000. I traced my finger over the itemized charges. There were thousands of dollars spent at luxury boutique hotels downtown, expensive jewelry stores, high-end steakhouses, and, finally, a massive $8,000 charge to the architectural firm that had drafted the blueprints for his and Chloe's fantasy master suite. The picture was suddenly violently clear. Mark wasn't just attempting to steal my home equity to fund his affair. He was actively committing identity theft against his own mother to finance the illusion of wealth. He was bleeding the golden goose dry, all while she went on Facebook to defend his honor and smear my name. He was a parasite feeding on 2 hosts simultaneously. I didn't call the police. That would have been too quick. It would have allowed Brenda to play the victim of a manipulative girlfriend trying to ruin her son's record. Instead, I let the family dynamic destroy itself. I gathered the 3 credit cards, the stack of $42,000 in billing statements, and the glossy architectural blueprints that boldly featured Chloe's name. I placed them all into a pristine, hardbacked FedEx envelope. But I didn't mail it to Brenda. Brenda would have covered it up to protect his image. I mailed it directly to Brenda's husband Mark's severe, deeply conservative stepfather, a man who controlled the family trust and possessed absolutely zero tolerance for financial liability. I sent it priority overnight, requiring a direct adult signature. The explosion happened exactly 24 hours later. I wasn't there to witness it, but the shockwave was undeniable. Mark's cell phone was abruptly disconnected. The venomous, defamatory posts on Brenda's Facebook page vanished without a trace, replaced by a deafening, humiliated silence. Over the next few weeks, through mutual acquaintances, the reality of his collapse trickled back to me. There was no legal defense he could mount. The stepfather had immediately frozen the accounts, initiated a fraud investigation, and cut Mark out of the family business entirely. Stripped of his mother's financial protection and my housing, Mark was forced into a tiny, rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city. The ultimate poetic justice, however, came from Chloe. The moment she realized the house wasn't his, the car was a lease, and the boundless wealth he had projected was entirely stolen, she packed her bags and left him. He had burned every bridge in his life to build a castle on my property, and he ended up standing in the ashes of his own entitlement. What do I know now that I didn't know before this happened? For a long time, I genuinely believed that love meant accommodation. I thought that if I was just patient enough, generous enough, and quiet enough, the people I loved would eventually respect the life I had built. I know now that accommodation without boundaries is just a polite form of self-abandonment. You cannot outlove a narcissist's inherent entitlement, and you cannot build a solid foundation with someone who secretly resents your success. The peace I have in this house today, the profound, uninterrupted silence of a space that belongs entirely to me, is worth every single terrible moment of that confrontation. I lost a 4-year relationship, but I kept my home, I protected my financial future, and most importantly, I finally met the version of myself who absolutely refuses to be made SM. Walking away quietly doesn't mean you failed, it means you finally woke up to your own power. So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.